Louisiana is a spooky place. At nighttime, I will not go out because there's a lot of creepy supernatural stuff that happens in New Orleans. Now, there's this woman named Sarah. Sarah said that she and her friends were down at the French Quarter. She said this one night they go to this bar and they're over in the corner just talking, having a good time. All of a sudden, this man walks through the door and he's dressed really nice. He's got this cape on. She said he was just this beautiful, immaculate looking person. And he just walked over by the bar and just stood there. And the whole night, her friends are talking to her and everybody's dancing and having a good time. But she could not take her eyes off this man. And she felt almost like she was in this trance. After about an hour, she gets this feeling she should go over and talk to him. So she walks over to where he's standing. She goes, "Hi, I'm Sarah." The man just turns. He walks out the front door. And she feels compelled to follow him. So she walks out behind him. And he goes out around the corner into the alley. And he goes back a ways. So she gets back there to where he's at. And she goes, "What are you doing out here? Why are you outside?" And this man turns and he grabs her by the shoulders and pushes her up against the wall. And he begins to try and go for her neck like he's getting ready to bite her. But then she hears her friends screaming her name. And when she looks, the man is gone. So she runs over to her friends and she's, in tears. And she goes, the man, he was going to get me. Like, I don't know who he was. And her friends were like, "Wait a second. What man? We seen you in the bar. You were talking to someone that wasn't there. You walked out of the bar by yourself and you went into the alley." And she swore up and down that she had seen this man. And for weeks, she could not get him out of her head. Now, New Orleans has also been a hotspot for paranormal activity, especially after the hurricanes hit. And shortly after Hurricane Katrina, there were a lot of strange things that happened. There was this older woman. She said she lived in the area close to where these dams had broken and Lake Pontchartrain leaked into the city. She said one night she was cooking dinner and she hears a knock at the front door. She goes to the front door, she answers it, and there's this small young girl in a purple dress, and she is completely wet, soaked in mud, and she's like, "Please, can you help me? I'm cold." And the woman said, "Absolutely, child, come inside." So she brings this girl inside and she sits her on the couch. She runs to go get her phone to call the police. But when she comes back to the living room, the girl is gone. She almost thought for a second that she had just imagined this until she's seen these wet, muddy footprints leading from the porch to the couch. So what do you think? Is New Orleans a creepy place? Payson, Arizona always gives me weird vibes. I don't know what it is about that place, but every time I go there, I feel uneasy. Now, it's this beautiful mountain town, but it's also very secluded. And it happens to be home to one of the most famous alien abduction cases. But there was a really creepy story that I heard out of the Payson area. There was this man named John. John said that his grandfather owned this 100-acre ranch outside of Payson. And he said he had hired this Native American man to take care of his sheep. And he lived there on this ranch in a small trailer. Well, one day, John's grandfather goes out to check on this man. And so he drives through the mountains out to his ranch. And when he arrives to the trailer, he is shocked to see that all of his sheep have been slaughtered and they are missing their skin. Something had basically taken their fur off. And he immediately thinks that something is wrong. So he jumps out of his truck and he goes to the trailer and he finds that it's locked. He starts banging on the door, calling for this man. He can't get in. So he goes around to a window, he breaks out the window, and he gets inside the trailer. And there he finds this man huddled in the corner, terrified, shaking, and in very bad shape. And he said this man kept saying this one word over and over again, and he couldn't understand what he was saying. It was his language, and he didn't know what it meant. So he tries talking to this guy, but the guy is just in too bad of shape. So he gets him in his truck, and he says, "I need to get him somewhere and get him some help." He starts leaving the trailer, starts going down this mountainous road. And all of a sudden, he looks out the right side of the window, and he sees something running alongside the truck. He describes it as a deer that's been flipped inside out, and it is running on two legs. And it was keeping pace with his truck, and he's going about 45 miles an hour. And he said this thing kept following them. And he, accelerated up to 60, up to 70, and it was still keeping pace with him. He said that's when this man started saying that same word over and over again that he was saying in the trailer. And he realized he is saying what he thinks this thing is. He's calling it by its name or whatever it is. Finally, this thing runs in front of the truck. His grandfather swerves, goes off the mountain, and they crash. The man who worked for his grandfather, he passed away. And so he was never able to talk to him about what had happened. His grandfather managed to live to tell the tale. But shortly after that, his grandfather sold that ranch and would never go back to that place. This story comes out of Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There was this man who said that when he was younger, he would go stay at his grandfather's house for a couple days at a time. Well, this one particular time, he goes over to his grandfather's house, and his grandfather was usually this cheerful, happy man who was always just excited to see his grandson. But for some reason, this time when he goes over to his grandfather's, he seems off. He's kind of nervous and very fidgety. And he starts noticing like his grandfather's doing all these strange things, like nailing the windows shut. And he's smudging, the windows and the doors. And, his grandfather tells him, look, if you go outside and play, you come in before the sun goes down. Don't stay out there after sundown. You come in the house. Which is weird because his grandfather never really cared about any of that. And one night, right, he overhears his grandfather talking to this other man that he has been seeing these star people in the sky and that he was worried they might come to his house. So the young boy, at this time doesn't really know who these star people are or know anything too much about what's going on. So one night, he goes to bed, and this boy wakes up in the middle of the night. And he said he sees 3 shadow-looking people standing in front of his doorway. And he said, they were so tall, they actually had to duck because their heads, right, were like almost hitting the ceiling. And he said these shadow beings, they just walked up to his bed, and they stood around him. They put their hands out, and he began to hover in the bed. And they started to move him out of his bedroom, down the hallway. And he said, he could see everything in real time, like everything that was happening. He hears his grandfather start coughing. And these shadow beings, they hear his grandfather as well coughing. They drop him, and they just took off, really fast towards the door and walk right through the doorway. And his grandfather comes out of the room, what's going on? Why are you out of bed? And he says, grandfather, and he tells him what had happened. And he said that his grandfather gave him like this talisman and said, when you go to bed, sleep with this, keep this by your side, do not lose this. And he said his grandfather didn't say anything about what had happened, but he could tell that his grandfather was even more bothered and that he knew that he was telling the truth. There's a very well documented case of a skinwalker that comes out of Phoenix. Now, there was this guy who came forward and he said that his mother lived next to like a couple 100 acres of desert. And he said, he was often afraid because she lived alone, but she did not want to move. Well, one night she awoke at like 2 a.m. and her dog was barking at the door. So she got up and figured he needed to go outside and use the bathroom. So she puts him on the leash and she starts walking him around the backyard. She said that's when she heard what sounded like her husband's voice coming from out in the desert behind some brush. She heard the voice say, "Are you there? Are you still there?" And she said, she called out her husband, Ingram, like, is that you? Is that you, Ingram? And she said the voice responded back, "Yes. Now come out here into the desert, come behind this brush. Just come on." And she's like, "No, Ingram, you are deceased." And so she took off running with the dog back into the house. Well, for several weeks, she would have something knocking at her door, banging at her windows. When she would go to answer the door, there would be no one there. She would hear laughs and screams coming from outside. And she, eventually told her son about what had happened. And he come over to the house a couple times, and he couldn't find anything or find anyone. They reached out to the police. The police set up patrols. They couldn't find anything or catch anyone that was harassing this old lady. And then she said one night there was a really bad thunderstorm. And after the thunderstorm had stopped, she hears a knock at the door. She goes to answer it, and when she opens the door, she's surprised to see her husband, Edgar. And she was so excited that she almost gave him a hug. But then she was like, wait a second. He's been deceased for, a couple of years now. And she said it looked like Edgar, but it was just like his face was just, something was off about it. It almost looked rubbery, kind of like the skin, was hanging off the cheekbone. And she said this thing that looked like her husband said, are you here still? It's me, it's Edgar. Like, let me in the house and give me a hug. And like, she was like, no, Edgar, you're deceased. You're not real. Like, you're not here. And she said, he kept saying, just let me in the house. Come on, I am real. I'm your husband. And so she said she pushed him away because he moved in like close on her. And as she pushed him away, she said he felt like ice cold. He turned and then ran off into the desert. So immediately she calls her son, who he calls the police. They go out there, they search the area, they couldn't find anything. Now, her son started to think like, okay, maybe she's like losing it as she's getting older because like we never see anything. And this, sounds pretty crazy what she's explaining. Until one night he happened to pull in front of her house and he said he sees this man standing next to her door. And when he locked eyes with him, he could see that he had these bright yellow eyes. And he said this man turned, took off running towards the desert, but he got down on all fours just like an animal. Clothing can actually be haunted. This story takes place in the panhandle of Texas. There was this older gentleman who one day went to a thrift store and he stumbles upon this old soldier's jacket, that looks like it's from the Civil War. And he says, whoa, this is amazing. Okay. So he takes this jacket and he buys it and he brings it home and he hangs it up in his bedroom on this, mannequin that he has. So one night he, was laying in bed and he looks over to where the Civil War jacket on the mannequin is, except it's not there. And he's thinking, where did my jacket and my mannequin go? And so he looks around his whole entire house. It's nowhere to be found. The next morning, he wakes up and it's back in his bedroom in the same place where it was before. About 2 weeks later after this, nighttime again, he's laying in his bed once again, can't sleep. When all of a sudden, his room just gets really bright and he sees these things start to focus in. There are 3 Native Americans in his room and they're just standing there looking at him menacing, and they start going closer and closer to him, and then boom, they just vanish. And so this happens a couple more times. He sees these Native American men in his room and they just vanish. So he thinks, what's up with this jacket? Like, ever since I brought this jacket home, all this weird stuff has been happening. So he takes this jacket to a historian because he thinks maybe this jacket is, has some history to it. And so he takes it to this historian, and the historian says this jacket was worn by a famous Civil War general who, after the Civil War, he fought in like a bunch of different engagements with Native Americans and, squashed these several uprisings, as they called them at the time, but really, who knows what had happened. But anyways, this jacket was connected to this general who was connected with all of these, all this history. And so he says, wait a second, this jacket is what's, bringing about these spirits. So he ends up donating the jacket to a museum. And from time to time, the museum says at night they see figures of what look like Native American men walking around the museum. This next story comes out of Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas. There is a farmer. And one day he's out in his fields and, he's doing some work when he stumbles upon these pair of pants. And these pants look, very old, like, something from the 1800s. And he thinks, oh, this is interesting. Like maybe when I was tilling the soil or something, like I dug up these pants because they were all kind of muddy and dirty. So he takes these pants back to his house and cleans them up and stuff. And, so he goes, eats supper and all that. It starts getting dark. And in the middle of the night, he looks outside the window and he sees those pants. They are running across his bean field. There's no person in it, no body, but the pants are running by themselves across this bean field. And so he gets out of his house and he, runs after these pants that are just like walking away. And as soon as he gets close, they just fall to the ground back in the field. And so he says, you know what? I'm not bringing those in my house. Like, this is weird. I'm just going to leave them there. And the next night, once again, he sees these pants just walking around the bean field. And, several nights passed where he'd seen that. And then one day the pants were just gone. And the neighbors in the town, said as well they would see these pants walking around by themselves with no body in it.